each bay me zilfum, Suthiad, Rachin, Sitha Sedgin, who each yaswingta hum, Erforth, Huila, oft throda, Britra Creos Cherry, Yabiden Haber, Yakuna Chela, Cher Selde Fella, Atol Uthia Jewelch, There Metcht off be yet, Ni Aro, nicht Wako, At Nechen Stef Nan, Thona het Bay, Cleefum Knossath, Thona het Bay, Cleefum Knossath.
Press the mute button on your. I think it must have been previous speaker. Okay, now to speak.
Hi, Mike.
That's better.
Oft him Anhager are gebietet, Metrudes Milzer, Feachtai he Mucharik, Jeon Dragolada, Longa Sheolde, Reran mit Handum, Primkalde Sei, Wadan Voraklast. Word be full arad. Swa quath Jarstava, Jarfada Gemundig, Morathra Walslakta, Winamaga Rura. Oft het shoulder Anna Utna Gebulka Minachara Quidan.
So the good news is we're going to use modern English as well. But I'd like to introduce us both. My name is Matthew Hollis. I'm a poet and editor and occasional translator. And I'm very pleased and honoured to be joined today by Bernard O'Donoghue, a poet of great skills, whom I've been an admirer and a reader of for a very long time, and for the last 10 years or so I've had the pleasure to work with. And funnily enough, when I was thinking about this, Bernard, before, I realised that most of what we're going to talk about, in some way we've collaborated on together. I first had the chance to collaborate with Bernard on his selected poems, and then 3 wonderful collections, Farmers Cross, The Seasons of Cullen Church, and more recently the Anchorage, which Bernard's going to conclude this morning's event by reading from. Bernard's also a great translator, particularly of the Middle English, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and is working on Piers Plowman at the moment, but is also a fine mind and translator of Old English poetry. And Bernard, why don't we just start by saying, what have we just been listening to?
Right, well, the group of poems from the Exeter book of Old English poetry, which dates from the late 10th century, the manuscript from the late 10th century. And it's in West Saxon, the language of the western part, the southern and western part of Old English. As one of the Matthew read from the Seafarer and I read from the Wanderer at the beginning of both, and they're a group of poems generally called elegy since the 19th century. Though in fact the term elegy is used in a rather strange way in application to them, because most of the great English elegies, and Adonais, Tircis and so on, are laments for the deaths of particular poets, in fact, by writing poets. Whereas these poems aren't like that. They're general reflections, really, on the hardships of life. And
They are, Bernard, and if for those of us that were in Katrina Portis's wonderful conversation with Patrick O'Brien earlier, Katrina was talking about the fishermen responding to portents and omens as being the end of the world, and that's something we might come and talk about a little bit later in this talk, because there is a sense of that in both of these 2 poems that we're talking about today. Why don't we just start with the Seafarer? Why don't we say a little bit about what we know about the poem, when it dates to, where it might be set, and things that we possibly can't talk about.
Yes.
But first of all, who was the Seafarer?
Yes, well, there's no figure in the poem who is called the Seafarer, whereas in the Wanderer there are various terms that are used to describe the speaker. At the very beginning, he's called an Anhaga, which is a thinker alone, a single thinker. So it's a word like recluse, in fact, might be a more natural translation for that. But then in line 5, he's called the Yardstopper, the world stepper, the kind of traveller. So he's a more identified figure than the Seafarer. The Seafarer is the voice of a poem about seafaring, isn't it?
But interesting, that first word you mentioned, because in the Seafarer is the word Anflagen,
Yes.
soul traveller, soul flyer.
Yes, yes.
Again, with that same sense of being the single entity within this universe, and which we'll talk a little bit about in some of the themes of the poems very shortly.
Yes.
And when do we think they were composed and how, Bernard? What do we know about that?
Well, apart from being able to date the manuscript in the 10th century, there's not much more you know. There's a group of poems in the Exeter book. The more or less the whole of surviving Old English poetry comes in 6 big codices, 6 big books. Most of the most celebrated and most familiar ones are in 4 of them. And the short poems, the familiar short poems like the riddles and the elegies and so on, are in the book called the Exeter Book, which is in Exeter Cathedral Library. That's all we know, really. I mean, there's some time before that.
The Seafarer is sometimes dated to early in the 900s, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's thought to be, and it is very interesting that we might think it could be dated to that, and that's presumably because we have certain dates that we can follow developments, as it were, in linguistics, where you can see words being used in certain places and times.
Yeah.
But as you say, when it was written down, something very interesting happened to both these texts, because we know that whoever may have composed them, and that's an interesting idea we might talk about in itself, in this era where we identify authors with text and so on. We also know that the person that wrote it down is very clearly a separate person in a separate time, with a separate series of principles and goals in mind. You want to say something a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, well, the other thing in relation to that is the method of composition called oral formulaic, and the poems are made up of units, of poetic units that are sort of transferable, expressing things like the elegiac, and ultimately, of course, they're religious poems as well. They're put together, really. They're assembled out of these small units called oral formulae. So there's some sections of these 2 poems, for example, where you could transfer the elements from one to the other, and it's what sometimes if you quote a line or 2, you have to think quite hard to remember which of those 2 poems it comes in, because there is this kind of overlap in formulaic composition. And there are other poems, one famous one called The Ruin, also in the Exeter book, which has the same elements in it. And the Wife's Lament, which you've also translated, Matthew, haven't you? Which begins with the same line as the Seafarer, in fact. So it's a common, even more than we're used to with poetic diction generally, it's a common kind of series of poetic formulae.
And in a moment we'll hear the translation of the Seafarer, and what you're saying about its evocation is quite interesting, because this particular poem begins with an invitation for the audience, as it were, to come in, to gather, to pay attention, to be involved in the community of the poem, which I think is a quite interesting thing that we may talk a little bit about later on. And Bernard, very interesting that you described these as being religious poems, because I suppose one of the things I was getting at there was that these were written down, as we think, in the 10th or 11th century by Christian scribes, who quite fundamentally changed what was thought to be the oral text as we know. And in the case of the Seafarer, as much as perhaps it's hard to say, but sometimes it's seen as a poem of at least 3 parts, where in the first half there seems to be an established sea voice reflecting on the hardship and the terrifying hardship of being at sea, and casting their eyes back to, almost enviously, the life on land and its safety, and the daring question about how can you appreciate the depths in life if you haven't taken the risks in life that I have on the sea. And then you get this sort of second turning in the poem, don't you, where actually some of that is scrutinised and interrogated to the point where sometimes people have said these must be 2 different speakers within the same poem, or an old sailor talking to a younger sailor. And then something else happens, doesn't it, when the Christian scribe interjects later in the poem.
Well, it's extraordinary kind of paradox. This person who's been describing very, very eloquently and stirringly the life at sea and the hardships of life at sea. And the trials of it. And then he suddenly said, because of all this, I am about to set out on my seafaring again. So what can this voice mean, if given how unattractive, so to speak, or how trying that experience is? Why should they want to set out on it again? And I suppose that it turns into a kind of consolatory pattern, really, consolation for hardship. And the very last word of the Seafarer, of course, is Amen. Even it ends up.
It's very interesting you mentioned that word, because I missed that word out, and that was picked up in someone saying that, not that I'd consecrated, as it were, consecrated the poem, but that I'd steered away from that religious conversation in the poem towards a more environmental one, and perhaps we might talk about that in a moment.
Yes.
But shall we hear this poem before we talk about the wonder?
Excellent.
Let's do that. Okay, so, and incidentally, the pictures that you're seeing behind are the wonderful photographs of Norman Macbeth. That is not Norman, that was badly timed interjection. The pictures you did see over my shoulder are by Norman Macbeth, with whom I collaborated in this project with Hazel Press, with a wonderful series of photographs, and they will play through our conversation. The Seafarer. Come, lean in for this song of myself. Bear with me these tides of telling. Days without dawn, nights of no end, the oceans upturning. I cannot calm the surge within. I cannot stop the wave from breaking. Lost to my lookout, watchful at prow, my keel hand shaking in the spill, driven too much towards rocks. Cold to my cage, my feet unfound, these bones a scaffold of frost. Then the starvation inside, mere weary to the core, more worry than care. Whoever settles their days on land will never know the wintered waste, the sheer alone, the friendless furrow, cloaks of icicle, hail flown, where nothing resounds, no stroke or beat, but a hammer-sung sea, its world of waves. Swan song sometimes, a whooper's wail, the gannet's row, these for company, or the curlew trying out its name. But nothing like the mirth of men. Gull cry where once there was mead hall. Storm there on stone, storm there on stone. Alone the ice tip turns answer, and more than once an eagle out of ether, salt-winged and sodden, but none like a friend. And so, little they believe, who, cupped in life, in the cradle of towns, washed with wine, outlain unknown, how weary in the sea way I remain. Enfolding dark, snow from the north, hail like the arrows of the earth, till corn itself grows cold. And so, How is it that the heart pulls harder, draws me deeper onto towering seas, commands me out to salt break, to go further in as I go further out, guided by this spirit quest, this unhoused host, as if it alone maps for where I'm going. And so, where is a man on earth more self-aware, more gifted or more fleet in youth, or in his acts so sure, or with such watchful master, that he embarks upon his journey without care for what his true master may confer? No harp does he hear within, no dreams of rings received, no wife with whom to warm, no hope on earth, no rhythm to his mind, but the pulsing sea, a mark that no salt can scrub free. Wood takes blossom, burrows bloom, meadows burden, spring hastens. The cuckoo, that ward of summer, unlocks a call from its chest hoard. You home, you home. Each propels the quick and the driven, those ready to journey, those who are given to ocean paths on which they must one day depart. How can landmen in their comfort know the exile into which the oceaned go? And so my mood turns to the mall, escapes a moment its locker of bones, to seek a threshold to the whale world, out on its tide and in again, restless and keen, lone flyer, soloist on the whale road, beyond the chorus of waters. And so more lasting to me is this realm of reckoning than the brief and barren life on land. I do not believe that wealth endures on earth. Always and without fail, one of three things will clarify how the final hour will be: sickness, old age, or the sword will call the one marked out for time. And so the only true test of any person is how they are spoken of after they are gone, that in their time they shall have acted well, stood against wrongdoing, railed against indifference, so that those who come after speak of them, and in that way ensure that their name on earth extends beneath these skies and finds a life unending because it is carried among friends. The days fall through my fingers. The shore recedes from sight. Neither kings nor Caesars nor the gold-giving lords remain of times before, when they moved with glory and renown. All now are gone. Splendor is gone. The world is left to the lesser, those whose sentence it is to toil. Few are remembered. Dignity on earth is brought low, and every man is diminished. Old age overtakes us. Our countenance pales. The heart greys with the hair. Too many friends have gone into the ground, each one born of higher hopes. As to that, our own bodies too must fail, till they know neither sunlight nor pain, till the hand slows and the mind no longer responds. Whether we gild the graves of brothers, or hoard for our own passing. Gold stays only with the living, and no amount can assuage a life misspent, or assay the debt in the final account. Fate kneels to no one, and so the earth must change. Secured on its sheet, well founded at four corners and in the skies above, it is a fool who does not detect a greater calling. He will be unprepared when the moment comes. Humility is a gift. Grace of light is a gift. A measured heart is stable. And so, with trust comes might. We must keep our compass fixed and keep it fixed. Live within trust, moderate our ways. We shall temper friend and foe alike. And though we will not wish suffering on any person, least of all the friends we have made, what happens is more than anyone can know. Let us think where we may have our home, and consider how we may reach it. Then strive to build a rapture that sustains, inseparable from life, under love's direction. Hope without limit, indebted to the realm in which we are raised, without beginning or end.
Well, you do end with the word end, just those.
But you can hear the change of tone, can't you,
Yes,
in that,
yes,
that poem
yes,
where the...
yeah.
And interestingly, we'll talk a little bit later about responses to translation. And though that's a poem of 124 lines, there are translations of the poem that simply cut out the last 60 or so lines
yes.
as being considered to be too Christianized.
Yes.
And Ezra Pound, whose famous translation we'll probably talk a little bit about, wouldn't translate the last 20 lines because he thought they were just a stick-on that was unnecessary.
Yes, yes.
But they offer a kind of zooming out perspective, don't they, Bernard?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think the one of the distinctions of the poem, I mean, whatever one thinks about the relationship between the narrative part at the beginning, about the hardship and the bird calls, or that great passage about the cuckoo and the curlew and so on. That's the attractive part of the poem. But there is a kind of paradox I've always thought, which is that even if the first part of the poem, with nature description and so on, is the attractive part, and the part that Pound didn't want to include at the end is the less attractive, the two together make a more important and finer thing than the nature part on its own would do, because of the relation between the two. One of the other terms that could be used to describe them as poetic forms is that the kind of moralization, really. I mean, the moralizing end is surely essential to the meaning of the poem, just as much as the narrative part at the beginning.
And so let's talk a little bit about that, because traditionally that's seen as a challenge where the Seafarer asks this question about the Socratic question, really, about the statement almost being the unexamined life is not worth living. And there's a test, isn't there, to those cupped in the safety of towns, washed with wine, having a nice comfortable life, that you won't understand the real depths and purpose of life unless you test yourself in this environment. And of course that's when the poem starts to speak towards a higher calling. It is a fool who does not detect a higher calling, which we traditionally understand as a religious calling. But it seems to me also it's possible to respond to that question as a different sort of spirituality, which is to do with your relationship with the natural world. And one thing that sometimes gets lost, doesn't it, when we think about the poems from this time, is the extraordinarily finesse, the understanding of the natural world around the people that were living there, because of their engagement with it at the time. And that's something that comes up in the Wanderer that we'll hear in just a moment. But is there something you'd like to say about that, really?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that one of the ways in which the narrative part of the poem, the early part of the poem, is more attractive is because it lends itself more naturally to that kind of spirituality, to the kind of spirituality of the natural world. But there is the last thought about the Christian interpretation, maybe, is that there's a famous moment in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the year 891, when three Irish monks, are washed up on the coast of Cornwall, and they say that people say, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "We are on a pilgrimage for the love of God, peregrinatio pro amore Dei," And the idea was that you cast yourself out onto the sea, as a seafarer does, and just place your trust in God, so you don't you encounter all the things of the natural world in very kind of strikingly, but you've done it for a reason. There is a kind of motivation. So one of the things, as well as consolation and elegy and so on, that poems could be called, is a sort of pilgrimage poem, really.
Yes. Absolutely. And part of that connection with the pilgrimage is there's an idea of exile, isn't there, which we need to talk about, especially the poem that you're about to read. And exile is obviously a big word at any moment in any society through history, but in the time in which early English was being written and this language was being spoken, exile had particular connotations, didn't it? Because you might be, your safety and your provision survived upon your understanding of living within your local lord's giving and benefacting, the ring givers. And if you cast yourself out of that, as the Seafarer appears to have done, and as we'll find from the Wanderer, you are in a relationship with nature alone, which you've got only your own resources to depend upon, and it's quite a frightening world, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And I mean, exile is a term that is used in the title of many medieval poems. In fact, poems like The Exile's Return and so on, in Middle English too. So exile is the essence of it, really.
So that takes us, I think, neatly onto the Wanderer, which you very kindly share with us now, and then we can have a little bit of chat about how these themes reappear, if that would be possible.
Yes, I mean, part of the appeal of the Wanderer, I think, is that this outcast figure, the sort of soul thinker, it can be translated into modern terms very strikingly, and I've done that with this translation bit. Beginning with the Anhager, the soul thinker. It's true that when you are depressed, you can be raised by the mercy of God, however bad things seem, however far it seems that you have strayed from the fields of home, as you stand smoking by the rail and watching the big waves hitting against the dark. But there's no cure for it. This is how the exile put it, refugee rather, when he thought of those terrible death-filled months. How often have I woken up to feel the weight still unlifted by the dawn chorus? And I don't dare change the medicine or go back to the doctor in case he tells me, pull yourself together. Oh, I know it's the thing to do, to pretend there's nothing wrong, however bad you feel. That's all very well, but your low spirits can't take much more, and shouting doesn't help. I'm sure this is why people with a bit of ambition often have to bottle it all up in quiet desperation. Just as I myself, in a desperate state, years from home and friends, and sick with misery, must chain my wretched tongue as I watch them burying my dear friends in the cold earth. I've gone anywhere since, attempting to find anyone to talk to me or give me a roof over my head, or something to turn my hand to. If you've been through it, you know what a poor companion grief is if you've not a friend in the world. You think about pilgrimage, not money, how your heart seized up, not about getting on in the world. You remember friends, how kind they were, the people who gave you money when you were small. All joy is now gone. Whoever lacks advice from any quarter knows this well. Sleep and sorrow are never parted, holding down the man that lives on his own. Dreaming, he thinks he shakes the hand of his neighbour, that he sits beside him on a fireside bench, just like the old days, listening to whatever was on the radio. Then he wakes up again, alone. The fire's gone out, and he sees at his feet the grey ash, listening to the crows protesting from the wind-blown pine screen, while the squall rages with a touch of sleet. That's when he feels his loneliness most, the longing for friends. He tries to imagine they're there in the room with him, laughing and talking. He talks back, peering at their faces, but no one's there. The travelling spirits fade into the corner without a word. The sorrow is back when friends can only be found in a fading memory. So what I can't understand is why on earth I don't completely give up on it all when I think of the end of everyone's days and how they all have left the arena, the strong and the good. In the same way, this precious earth weakens a fraction each passing day, something that only the aged man appreciates fully. You have to be patient, not too impetuous in thought or in words, not cowardly but not violent either. Don't flinch, but don't press your own case. Don't be greedy, don't start boasting until you're sure what you can achieve. When you start holding forth, be sure you know exactly what your drift is and where it will end. Any person with a spark of sense must know by now how desperate it will be, and the whole of our dear world stands silent and empty. Already in places they've had to abandon traditional fields when the ground has dried out or the oil is used up. Cities lie in ruins, populations lie dead, their bodies heaped by the crumbling walls. Some die in battle, but more are victims of assault from the skies. Some are left for scavengers to come under cover of night to steal what they can. Few have the honour of dignified burial by friend or relation. Whatever it was brought the world into being reverses the process till all is a void. The person who has grasped the order of things and fully understands the depth of this tragedy has time to reflect on the endless conflicts and lament for the future. Where have machines gone? Where are the drivers? What has become of friendship and holiday? Alas for the paintings, alas for cathedrals and the places where people were happy together. It has all passed away to the depths of the dark as if it never had been. Now in their place there's a desert of tar, with hardly a trace of the lines on the map where once there were streets. The bombs have won out, achieving their ends. The driver's a mummy congealed in his seat. So much for him. The wind whirls around, sand drifts or snow drifts depending on where. Winter triumphant, too cold or too hot as the north moves south, destroying all growth. Everything's hard in the state of the world, changed for the worse by the rule of the heavens. Riches won't last, and neither will friendship. Man, least of all, his relations are all gone. Everything on earth will shudder and die. That's what he said, this solitary wise man. It's good to keep faith and not to reveal the fear in your heart if you can't see a way of making things better. All you can do is to place your trust in the God in the heavens, where alone is stability, if it is found anywhere.
I found that a very moving poem, Bernard, and I mean partly it's your great treatment of it, and this lovely conversational lightness that you bring into that poem as well, and the manufacturing element that we might talk about what we look in a poem, how we bring it to a modern audience. And also so striking about some of the thematic overlaps with the two poems, because there is even a theory that they are somehow the same poem, or that the head of one has been put on the tail of another by clerks making mistakes, or simply the oral culture moving through different passages of time. And yet both of them still seem to urge us, do they not, to make some sort of intervention in the way we are living and what we value, and the world in which we're interacting with, which seems to be such a modern, contemporary demand.
Yes. And I remember teaching this poem in the 1970s, a very long time ago, and in the era when there was sort of fears about nuclear war and so on, both Cuba and so on, and that passage about everything being gone and snow-ridden and so on and frozen. Commonly people suggest that it's a kind of nuclear winter, something extraordinary, that an element from one kind of cultural moment can be transferred in that way into another.
Absolutely fascinating and brilliant, isn't it? Because what's so moving about being engaged in these thoughts and writings were, to some degree, how some of the worries as human beings seem actually quite timeless.
Yes.
And although we have different environmental pressures, but they were so responsive to the environment. The sea and the river was your highway, wasn't it, as well as your source of food, and so you had to understand the rhythms of it. You had to look after the rhythms of it, and it might look after you if you were honouring of that moment. But catastrophe is always a possibility, isn't it?
Yes. And the personal nature of the way the encounter with the environment is evoked in the poem, not being able to sleep, that kind of thing. It's remarkably kind of universal, isn't it?
Look, and we say it's universal, of course, but every time, whenever we translate or we look at something like this, somebody else is going to bring different things at different periods. One of the things that fascinates me, and maybe you could just say a moment on this, Bernard, is that although we think these poems were already composed in these cases 900s, written down 100, 150 years or so later, they then sort of disappear, don't they? Until, the first modern English translation of the Seafarer is 1826. What happens in between?
I suppose that it's a change in the culture, isn't it? I think, so to speak, Middle English takes over from Old English. The French element comes in as to work with or replace the Germanic world that preceded it, really. So it's a kind of 12th century Renaissance in a way. So I think it's not just a poetic thing like that, how the poems are constructed, but it's a kind of view of the world, really.
So almost as if there was a disconnection that we reconnect to more recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think,
that phrase that is frowned upon in use now, the Dark Ages.
Yes, exactly.
And as if this material came from a time in which we have nothing to learn from it.
Yes.
We don't hear the Dark Ages so much now, do we? We hear early English used or something like that.
Yes, absolutely, that's right. It depends what you mean by dark as well, of course, doesn't it? I think there is a sense in which the phrase the Dark Ages could be seen in positive terms, really. It isn't just dark meaning ignorant, just dark meaning a kind of shadowed, something interesting in that kind of way as well, really.
And of course, when people do encounter the poems, as they began to in the 19th century, they're reflecting their concerns of their time, aren't they? And so we do see this sort of shift in response and pattern and theme within the poems and the translation. But something very interesting happened with the Seafarer, didn't it, in 1911, where a young American by the name of Ezra Pound showed up in London and translated this poem, and it almost exploded the poem somehow, didn't it? Because it made him very well known for his translation, but it also changed our response to the poem. And I thought perhaps we could just hear a little bit about it. We got a little burst from that poem.
Yes.
And one remarkable thing to say is that it's a poem with drums in.
Mm.
So listen to this. It's just 30 seconds of it.
Songs through Trecon, journeys, jargon, how I in harsh days hardship endured oft. Bitter breast cares have I abided, known on my keel many a care's hold and dire sea surge. And there I oft spent narrow night watch nigh the ship's head, while she tossed close to cliffs, coldly afflicted, my feet were by frost benumbed.
Isn't it fascinating? I mean, that percussive sense that he has. It's like listening to somebody moving through an orchestra when the instruments have been knocked on the floor slightly, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Totally stunning.
And very much the tune of the original, of course. I mean, people misunderstood Pound tremendously. I mean, Pound is a wonderful translator from many languages, from Italian to Chinese to Latin and so on. Well, people assume that because he doesn't translate elements literally, that he doesn't understand them, but of course he does. I mean, for example, the second line of the Seafarer, the first half of it, Siddhas Sejam, which means journeys to speak of journeys. Now, Pound knows it means that, but he doesn't do it literally. The phrase he uses is journeys jargon, which isn't an accurate translation, but it's exactly the poetic shape and sound of the original. It's these two trochees, Siddhas Sejam, journeys jargon. And that he reproduces the form of the original.
He does.
At the expense of the literal sense, to great effect, I think, really.
But that idea of considering poetry a little bit like a mirror or a looking glass, in which there'll always be a reflection of yourself, though it'll be different because it's in reverse, and there'll always be a reflection of what's in the scene around you, the environment, the room, the time. You'll always see that pattern. That seems particularly true of the act of translation, isn't it, where you're in this sort of conference, sometimes with a known living author, in this case not. How has some of these themes and processes influenced your poems, Bernard? Because we'll turn to those for the last moments, if we may, in a moment.
Yeah.
But that process of translation and your own writing, or even some of the themes that we pick out from The Wanderer and The Seafarer, of trust, involvement, engagement, exile, the things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Has that been a useful source for you?
I think translation in various senses, is a great kind of motor for things, really, because it means lots of different things. I mean, I taught Old English for 50 years, and Old English translation, what you're translating for the literal sense of the original, and for people to do exams, they had to know exactly what something meant. So that's one sense of translation. But that kind of evocative translation the Pound does is something else, and that kind of offers you something else you can do. I mean, it's interesting that there is a poem by Auden as well called The Wanderer, which is related to the Old English poem, but it's so unlike it that you're not quite sure what the connections are, and it's deeply in the spirit of the poem, So I suppose translating for the letter or the spirit really is one of the things, isn't it?
Yeah. Turning to the Anchorage, if we may, which is your new book, and I had the great pleasure of working with you on the poems, but one of the extraordinary themes of this book is a sort of exile in age, and there are great poems of land in which there is almost a hermitage around some of those experiences, and there are great poems of sea in this book as well, in which that relationship between land and sea is kind of tested as well. And perhaps you don't see that rooting out of Old English poems, perhaps that comes from other sources in your life, but it seems to rise astonishingly well with vivacity in these poems in the Anchorage.
Yeah, I mean, I've always just said, and I've said it in writing even as well, that my model of the perfect kind of lyric poem is the Old English elegies, really, because this notion of it's founded in experience, which then goes on to use the experience for some kind of purpose. a moral purpose or a poetic purpose or something, you know. So the kind of A-B shape of the poems, I think, is tremendously influential and something you quite kind of escape from, really.
But would you mind sharing some of the poems that we were just talking about, possibly from the Anchorage, just for this last 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, and
for Farms Cross.
And your poem?
I think I'd rather hear yours.
I'd rather hear yours.
No, I need so. I would rather hear yours, and it's brand new and it's wonderful, and I would love the audience to hear as much as we can from this.
Oh, thank you very much. I think you were better in his hand. I've several of the poems in this book and several things I've written about is I think kind of diagonal from here, really, in that I'm deeply kind of wedded to the northeast of England as well as the southwest of Ireland and this diagonal across these islands, you know. So I mean, it's striking, I think, in a place like this, to see how it reflects, how it's like, and maybe in some ways unlike, but mostly like, really, the seashore of the southwest of Ireland as well, you know, the west coast. We spent a lot of our time travelling between. Heather, my wife, is from the northeast of England, so spent a lot of time there, and also at the other end of the diagonal. And we travel several times a year from South Wales to the southeast of Ireland, from Fishguard and Pembroke to Rosslare. And we go through exactly the same sequence all the time of waiting for the ferry and so on. This poem is thinking about that, really, connections, also the connections between South Wales and the southwest of Ireland, which is a profound one as well. Sandpipers at Rosslare. The standard procedure is to fill up with petrol, just past the long scenic sweep down into Dungarvan, to drop the bags at the Rosslare Lodge and drive to the beach behind the ferry port, where our boat is all business preparing to set off. It will reach Wales and then cross back for us to embark in the morning. As the twilight deepens, the on-off of the Tusker light finds its range. We're watching a stone chat swaying precariously on its perch. And at the water's edge, a small flock of sandpipers is pattering to and fro, letting us almost catch up, then shrilling off in a sparkling V of flight to settle on a new ridge of sand 50 yards ahead. Having escaped us, they run to the sea, which in turn runs at them, so they double back. This is where they live. It's where they will be when we next set out from the same perfect point of departure. And the other poem I might read is there's an area called Beara, the southwesternmost point really of Ireland, the Beara Peninsula. It's a very atmospheric and beautiful place, really. And this is just thinking of what it is like there. And it's got an epigraph which says, "Don't worry if you can't guide a steady line. Use as your medium a shaky line." That was said by the painter Byam Shaw to Evie Home, who's also a painter. The shaky line. I remember best the contours of the hills, their rough-edged, rounded tops of heather purple, the rocks behind the village worn away like overworking molars, a perfect backdrop, looking as there's nothing to the back of them. The painter who coloured in this landscape has scribbled the sea line so that it forms not too precise an edge against the land, where crooked fields free-wheel down to the sea. If you choose the right vantage point, round the corner northwards on this coast, then move up the road in second gear, the lesser Skellig will move across the greater, so it disappears as by a sleight of hand, then slowly reappears, a pale spirit, inviting a polite round of applause. That's a bad moment to end on, actually.